So this is the module that you have all been waiting for, the module where you learn how you get paid. The way you present yourself, the way you behave in your preparation, and the way you clarify your process, all of these will have an impact on how you're perceived by potential clients. Ultimately, if you do a poor job differentiating yourself in your process, you will end up having to differentiate by your price. What does this boil down to? If your prospective client perceives great value in partnering with you, they will be more willing to pay a fair price for your service. If your prospective client perceives very little value in your process, you will be the victim of some very tough negotiation. On top of that tough negotiation, you may also encounter challenges in how the client treats and regards you in the search process. In this next module, we're going to break down clearing your fee into 3 segments. We're going to give an overview of the types of service charges that exist. We're going to talk about presenting your professional recommendation to your client. And we're going to cover the top fee clearing objections that you will face and some possible rebuttals to help you navigate through those situations. This is really one of the most important parts of client development. If you have a stellar marketing presentation, a great candidate, and a possible client, but do a poor job of presenting the search solutions and clearing your fee, you're going to have a hard time driving the cycle of the search process. Let's start with covering the types of service charges that you have to choose from when it comes to creating your professional recommendation for this client. There are numerous options that you have when it comes to customizing your service charge and approach to the needs of your client. We're exposing you to a variety of types of service charges and fee percentages. You, though, and possibly your partner, leader, or owner, may decide to offer only one type. Perhaps you're exclusively a 100% retained firm or a 100% contingent firm. It is still very important to understand the variety of options, even if it's ultimately decided to only offer 1 or 2. In this section, we'll give you an overview of the most common types of service charges: contingent recruiting, retained recruiting with no placement commitment, and financially committed search. It's certainly important to understand the types of service charge options, but it is equally important to understand the why behind your professional recommendations. In this module, we will help you understand what is in the best interest of both the client and the recruiter in each suggested approach. Our first option is a contingent recruiting approach. In a contingent recruiting search, no fee is charged until you have filled the position. Like we said in our first module, with a contingent relationship, you could have 20 candidates interview over the course of 7 months, and you will not get paid until they hire one of those 20 candidates. A contingent relationship clearly creates a very low-risk environment for the client and a very high-risk environment for the recruiter. Because of this, most recruiters will adjust some of the variables in the agreement to reflect the risk that they are taking on a contingent basis. Some recruiters will charge a higher fee percentage, offer a shorter guarantee period or none at all, or ask for an exclusive contingency to adjust for taking this risk. Let's start to expand on the list that we started in Module 1 and talk further about why a client would prefer to use you on a contingent basis. Number 1 reason is that obviously there is no risk to them, as no fee is paid until the recruiter has performed successfully and a hire is made. Signing a contingent agreement does not automatically equate to them paying you any monetary amount whatsoever until whatever time they deem that a candidate you present to them is worth the fee you're charging. It's a very easy way for this client to be able to have access to the candidate that you've networked with without having to put any skin in the game to have that access. The second reason a client would prefer to use you on a contingent basis might be because they don't have an urgent and critical need, but they want to be made aware of candidates that might be a possible upgrade or a solid addition to the current team that they have in place. They don't want to pay you any money up front because they don't know if or when their next hire will take place. They simply know that they want to have a chance to view all of their possible options for upgrading or adding to their current team. The third reason is that they might want to try before they buy and test your capabilities before committing to a financial obligation. They might want to use this initial contingent search as an opportunity to do a dry run and test your true ability to identify, evaluate, attract, and then land the type of individuals that you say you can. This can be used as a good initial stepping stone into developing a committed and exclusive professional relationship. Let's say that you've opened the door for this level of conversation by taking an MPC to market. If this client is interested in quickly speaking with your MPC, the fourth reason that a contingent approach might be preferred by the client is because it's an easy agreement to execute, so they can then have a conversation with your candidate. If they sign the contingent agreement, then review this candidate's resume and decide that they weren't as interested as they thought they were, they aren't on the hook for any further conversations or interviews with you. If they solely have an interest in speaking with your candidate but don't need a fully executed search, a contingent agreement can work well. The fifth situation that you'll encounter is related to our previous situation with the MPC. If this client has an open position but has several viable candidates in process, they might still be interested in signing a low-risk agreement in order to view any additional candidates that you would like to submit for consideration. They might be close to filling this position on their own, but they want to ensure that they truly have surfaced the best candidate in the market to hire. So they want to at least have access to any other candidates who come along. The sixth reason a client would prefer to use you as a contingent recruiter is because of volume. There are certain situations in which your client might have a very short time frame in which they need to hire an exorbitantly high volume of candidates. It might simply be unrealistic to have one firm fill them all, and so it necessitates several firms working on a contingent basis on the same search to make sure that they get the sheer volume of candidates necessary to staff their project. Last, and this is a reason simply to keep in the back of your mind, last, some clients will sign a contingent agreement with you because it is of no risk to them and they perceive that it keeps you from recruiting out of their organization for a while. When you have a client who signs a contingent agreement, you more than likely will ease off of calling into that company for a while because you anticipate that this source is turning into a client. Every once in a while, you might find that this client has no true intentions of ever hiring someone from you, but they perceived this as being a way to keep you from calling their associates for a while. Again, this isn't a common occurrence, but it's a good thing to be aware of. If you ever feel that a client has partnered with you on a contingent basis simply to prevent you from calling into their firm, it's smart to have a candid conversation with that hiring manager. Again, this isn't typical, but if you find that your contingent client becomes completely unresponsive, you might have encountered this last reason for working on a contingent basis with recruiters. So now that we've looked at the benefits of contingent recruiting from the client's perspective, let's talk about our perspective for a minute. Although this is a higher risk situation, there are still certainly some times when you would recommend a contingent approach to this client. First, since there's no risk, this is usually an easier agreement to get signed. No money is due up front, no further action is required on the client's behalf, and all in all, it just might be an easier agreement to get signed and back quickly. The second reason you might want to work on a contingent basis is because you don't want your sense of urgency and commitment to be significantly higher than that of the client. If they have no urgent hiring needs, you want to match that urgency by simply sending candidates as you identify them, versus prioritizing this client above all others because they've now paid you something up front. You want to make sure that you work with this client in a cooperative way, not pushing your candidates through their process because you feel obligated to fulfill your retainer. Third, you might want to try before you buy this client, just like they might want to do for you. Perhaps you're concerned with something that you uncovered during your search assignment call. Maybe they described to you an incredibly lengthy interview process with a lot of people involved and steps to take, and you're concerned about keeping candidates interested and excited during such a lengthy process. Maybe you're concerned that the compensation range they quoted is not too competitive within the industry, and you want to evaluate their ability to make viable offers. Maybe you've noticed a track record of interviewing numerous candidates and overscreening all of them. Quite simply put, if you're concerned that this might be a difficult client to work with collaboratively, this can be a good trial approach before you're committed to a dedicated agreement or being on the hook to solve their hiring problems. Fourth, if you're taking an MPC to market and you're looking to get an interview with as little red tape as possible, this might be the best approach. Like we stated earlier, if this client opens up the resume you sent over and realizes that the candidate you sold them on isn't the candidate you sent over, they can simply delete the resume and move on with their day. By the way, this should never happen. If you take an MPC to market, you should close prior to sending over the resume by saying, if the person I just described to you is the resume you're about to open, are there any other questions you have or reasons that you wouldn't want to have an initial conversation? You should never rely on the resume to do the selling for you. You should sell and close while you've got this hiring authority on the phone, and then the resume should be nothing more than just reinforcement of your conversation. Fifth, perhaps this search falls into the matching and presenting bucket because the position is for something outside of your immediate niche or area, or you simply just don't have the time to truly dedicate the recruiting energy in the time frame needed. Maybe you aren't quite sure of your ability to dedicate the amount of time needed to fully uncover this new tangential marketplace, but you'd still like to keep the door open to send viable candidates if you do find them. If you feel it's a possibility that during the course of your recruiting calls, you might stumble across this type of candidate, again, perhaps you want to keep that door open. We talked about these situations when we talked about categorizing a search into the mapping bucket. If the search is for an administrative assistant and you don't place administrative assistants, but you certainly talk with them during the course of getting to your decision makers, perhaps you want to present the opportunity to a few of them and see if there's any interest. Perhaps you want to do a quick search through your database and spend an afternoon calling those candidates who you've listed as being administrative assistants. Or perhaps you want to post this position on a job board or on your website to see if you get any strong bites. But the bottom line here is that even if you're going to deviate outside of your niche, you aren't going to commit so much time to it that it takes you too far outside of your core market, which is why you might want to recommend the contingent relationship. Sixth, you might not be sure that the candidate this client is looking for truly exists. Again, remember this example from our previous module. Maybe this client has specified that they want someone who speaks 2 languages, graduated from an Ivy League school, has won some awards, and has donated blood. This is a pretty difficult person to find, but it might be possible. You can certainly keep your eyes and ears open for the right person. But again, you're not going to be held accountable for filling this position, which is why you would not want to ask for a financial commitment on this particular assignment.
So to recap, an attention relationship, no fee is charged to the client until the candidate has been placed. Sometimes this relationship is in the client's best interest. Sometimes this relationship is in your best interest. You have to understand the pros and cons from both perspectives. Solely was truly craft, Dr. Only Edition.
Let's move on to retained recruiting. In true retained search, there's an upfront payment to initiate the search, and then one or several payments paid upon milestones that are based on a time frame, not on performance. This is an important differentiation from the financially committed approach that we'll cover in a minute. Recognize that these payments are made upon time frame milestones, not performance parameters like presentation of candidates or acceptance of an offer. What I mean by time frame milestones is that, for example, in a truly retained search, a payment would be made to initiate the search, and a second or third installment of the estimated fee would be made after an agreed upon number of days have passed. The final payment would be received if the actual compensation offered to the candidate is higher than what was estimated when the search began. Let's say that your service charge is 30% of the first year's salary, and your client anticipates that they will pay this candidate $100,000. The total fee is therefore estimated at $30,000, and you could break that down into 3 payments. $10,000 is due up front to initiate the search, $10,000 is due after 30 days, and the remaining $10,000 balance is due 30 days after that. Now let's say that they end up hiring a candidate for $120,000, which was above what they estimated the original offer to be. That remaining $6,000 would be due as well once they have an acceptance of the offer from that candidate. Most recruiters have a hard time with this approach initially and will agree on a compromise that resembles the financially committed recruiting approach that we'll talk about in a minute. However, if you are able to secure a true retained relationship, it absolutely cements a truly consultative association between you and your client. Again, let's talk for a moment about why a client would want to use us on a retained basis. First, they more than likely have a need that's urgent and critical, and they need to be able to ensure that someone is held accountable to fully covering the marketplace on their behalf. They not only want to make sure that this search is a priority, but they want to make sure that even if the searching gets tough, the recruiter keeps going. Second, perhaps they need tremendous amounts of documentation provided as it pertains to the search, or they want market research performed in addition to the placement of a candidate. Let's say, for example, that they are unsure how much exactly this type of individual is worth in the market. They want you, in addition to finding them the right candidate, they want you to do a full salary survey in the marketplace as well and provide detailed documentation as to the levels and components of the compensation packages that exist for this kind of hire. This kind of reporting goes above and beyond what's included during the typical course of a search, and this is a great way for you to be able to roll two services into one package. Third, this client might want to absolutely ensure that you truly act as a consultant on their behalf and are not tied to the placement simply because of a fee attached to that individual. This is their way of paying you for your true consultative approach, and it will eliminate any possible concerns or issues that they may have had in the past with recruiters trying to make a quick placement. And fourth, they might want to compare outside candidates to their internal candidates, but want all vested interests removed. Before we move on, let's again talk about our perspective for a minute as it relates to why we would want to recommend a retained approach. First and foremost, money up front. That's always a good thing. So let's get that out of the way because there are certainly equally important reasons why you'd want a client to retain you. Second, this client is fully committed to partnering with you to solve their problems. When you have a true retained client, you know that they don't just view you as a vendor. They trust your opinion, your insights, and your recommendations. They're going to be responsive with calls and emails and interview feedback. They don't just have some skin in the game, they have a lot of skin in the game, and they're going to respond much more cooperatively because of that mutual commitment. Third, since you would have negotiated for exclusivity for this search, it gives you the opportunity to completely research and cover the market, knowing that you are the only recruiter responsible for this position. You'll avoid the frustration that sometimes happens when the market is saturated with multiple recruiters working on the same search assignment, and you'll avoid any issues of duplicate candidate ownership from other recruiters. Last, the chances of a retained client turning into a repeat retained client are very high. This is typically a springboard to a long-term, lasting client relationship. You might find, though, that clients perceive a true retained search as only being appropriate for their senior level positions. Frequently, their preconceived notion is that this level of engagement is reserved for, say, VP level positions and above. Let's move on to what is usually a common halfway point between contingent recruiting and retained recruiting, which is the financially committed or dedicated search approach. Sometimes this is referred to as a container or retingency, as it's a hybrid of contingent and retained. This is typically used as a stepping stone to moving a contingent client to a retained client. Usually, financially committed search is the fallback option for recruiters who try to sell a retainer with no placement commitment but are unsuccessful. In a financially committed search, there is an upfront payment to initiate the search, and then one or several payments following that are paid on milestones based on performance. Performance milestones could be interviewing an agreed upon number of candidates, acceptance of an offer, or the date the candidate begins employment. The initial payment is typically non-refundable, which is a risk that the client is taking, and therefore usually getting a reward like greater allocation of your resources or a longer guarantee period, and you'll negotiate for exclusivity on this particular position and search. So again, let's go over the reasons why a client would want to use you on a financially committed basis. First, it could very well be that their need is urgent and critical, and they need to be able to ensure that someone is held accountable to fully covering the marketplace on their behalf. Again, recognize that this isn't the same thing as you promising that you will fill the search. Although it's implied, there are several issues that could be instigated by the client that could put the search on hold or be eliminated. But in essence, what this client is doing when they retain you up front is that you will do everything in your power to cover the marketplace and share their story. We said it before, when this particular search gets tough, you will keep going. In a contingent setting, you might be tempted to move on to a search that seems closer to closing or easier to fill. Not the case in a committed search. If the search gets tough, you'll figure out ways to still be effective. This search will be a priority, and if you said that you'd have 3 people to them by Friday, you'd better be answering the phone on Friday afternoon, either with a summary of the 3 people or get ready to work the weekend to fulfill your commitments. This is a great way for the client to ensure accountability. Second, perhaps this client has been burned by recruiters in the past. Perhaps they had a bad experience with recruiters who have overpromised and underdelivered in previous situations. In this financially committed search, you're putting performance milestones in place that will help them feel more comfortable that you're invested in this process. For example, if this client had an issue with a recruiter who said that they would send over some candidates and then they never heard from that recruiter again, you could make your payment due upon the interview of 3 candidates. Therefore, you're helping this client feel more comfortable with the fact that this previous issue will be avoided, and you have some further incentive to continue to make progress on the search. Third, since they're sharing some of the risk by putting some money up front to initiate the search, you might negotiate some more favorable terms, again, a higher allocation of your resources or perhaps a longer guarantee period. For instance, in a contingent search, you might have a 30-day replacement guarantee, but in a committed search, you extend that to 90 days or maybe even longer. Again, these can vary from office to office and situation to situation, but typically you'll work some parameters into your search that are more favorable terms. This can also be a great leveraging tool when it comes to negotiating a client from a contingent relationship to a committed one. Next, this commitment and exclusivity typically allows you to feel comfortable using this client's name in the marketplace when you're telling their story. Now, there could certainly be a situation where the client needs their name to be kept confidential. Perhaps this is a search for a role that includes a great deal of proprietary information. Or maybe this is a replacement search and the role is currently filled by someone not performing up to expectations. However, if this is a situation where you can use this client's name in every conversation, this results in some extraordinary free press that they will be able to feel. Think about it. You're calling into competitors, sharing the awesome story about the phenomenal things that are happening across the street. You're doing that, say, 20 times a day, 100 times a week, 400 times a month. There starts to be an overall buzz that's generated that isn't necessarily pinpointed back to your actions. But any client who enters into a financially committed relationship where they authorize the use of their name, they'll experience a great deal of free press that will start to impact their general reputation in the market, add some unsolicited resumes coming in the door, and it can actually be a great way to debut the announcement of new products or branches or divisions, since this is reaching the passive candidate pool. And since all candidates are routed through you, the vested interest is removed, and you're not concerned about your candidates versus their candidates. Fifth, a client might want to engage in a financially committed search because they would like a market analysis, which could include weekly or monthly summaries of who was talked with, what the feedback was, and how to best continue to execute this search. On a weekly basis, perhaps this client wants a general summary of the activity that happened that week. This could be a brief report of possibly the companies that were called upon, the results of those calls, and maybe even the specific resistance to their opportunity. This can be used to tweak the parameters of the search or possibly give this client some insight that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. Think about it. If you talk with 100 candidates a week and share with them your client's story, what if 2 of those candidates are interested and 98 of them say no because they've heard horrible stories about how the department is managed? This kind of feedback can help your client be more acutely aware of what's being said about them in the marketplace and then course correct based on the legitimacy of that feedback. Clearly, there are a number of reasons why a client would want to engage you on a committed basis, and it's important for you to understand those so you can articulate them to your prospective hiring authority. Just as we've done with the other approaches, let's quickly cover why we, as recruiters, would love having a client commit to us on a financial basis. In a nutshell, it's the same reasons why we would want someone to retain us. Of course, you always love getting cash in, and that initial retained payment is just that. But second, this client is fully committed to partnering with you to solve their problems, which means they're going to be more responsive and more cooperative. Third, since you would have negotiated for exclusivity on this search, you can rest assured that you are the only recruiter tasked with getting the search filled. And finally, the chances of a retained client turning into a repeat retained client are very high. You will hopefully, of course, if you've exceeded expectations, you will commonly find that when you successfully complete a search, the client will pay you the full fee and then simply keep the initial retainer open for the next search that they now have. This is a great way to develop long-term client relationships.